Distinguished ministers, dear friends, it's such an honor, really, and pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, especially as being one of the first members of the European Parliament to call for a conference in the Parliament back in 2012 on Rail Baltica, and I can vividly remember Commissioner Siim Kallas, for example, appearing in that conference. Rail Baltica is an essential project for Europe and especially for Europeans. This is also very well understood in the European Parliament. A significant part of the funding is coming from the EU budget, which is closely tied to the multi-annual financial framework. I would first like to say a few words on the post-2020 MFF before continuing on the importance of getting this project done. The multi-annual financial framework, MFF, sets priorities and limits to annual EU spending for the next 5 to 7 years. This kind of medium or long-range financial planning is central for large-scale projects such as infrastructure. As the current MFF will end in 2020, the Commission will give its proposal on the next one and on the sectorial instruments this May, that's already in a few weeks' time, after which the Member States will then have to negotiate among themselves, find a unanimous agreement, and get the European Parliament's consent. Before the MFF and the sectorial negotiations are concluded, there is no certainty whatsoever that the potential beneficiaries will get any funding for their projects, nor that our common policy goals are achieved. So there is no time to fool around. The European Union should not be a source of uncertainty. The context for the negotiations is very difficult, to say the least. We have many serious challenges ahead of us: migration, security, Brexit, and the consequent budget gap. We Europeans have to do more together, particularly on issues where cooperation brings better results and demonstrated added value for everyone. We have to further economic development and cohesion across borders and in all regions. That would benefit all Europeans, but not at any price whatsoever. There has to be conditionality, and European values must be respected. But the most important thing is that Europe needs a strong budget and a strong MFF. This is why in the next MFF, in my opinion, there has to be enough money for big cross-border transport infrastructure projects, such as Rail Baltica. Europe is built on free movement of people, ideas, and goods. Developing transport infrastructure, making it smoother, more efficient, and more convenient contributes to jobs, growth, climate action, cohesion, and common values. It makes life simply better and Europe more competitive. Transport policy is also a shared competence, so it is the European Union's job and responsibility. Ladies and gentlemen, a couple of words as a little reminder of why we all love TEN-T, the Trans-European Transport Network. It is the link that ties MFF and Rail Baltica together. It's in short a Commission policy which aims at completing a European-wide, purposeful and modern network of roads, railroads, inland waterways, maritime shipping routes, ports, airports, etc. Basically, it's a map of Europe on which the most important connections are drawn on, as you could see in the video. We love TEN-T because it strengthens Europe's global competitiveness and creates sustainable, smart and inclusive growth. It works for decarbonization, and we also love TEN-T because it has incredible added value. The completion of the core network will lead to generating at least 1.8% additional GDP, mobilize 13 million job years, and remove 7 million tons of CO2 emissions by 2030. That's in 12 years. TEN-T strategic framework and the long-term infrastructure plans are key enablers for achieving EU common objectives: sustainable growth, jobs and competitiveness of EU economy, as well as efficient functioning of EU single market. And we also love TEN-T, at least I do, because it's big. By 2030, the completion of the TEN-T core network corridors will require about 750 billion euros worth of investments. The largest percentage of this amount will come from the national budgets of member states. EU grants will form another significant contribution. TEN-T, especially the so-called corridors and completing them, are given priority when money is scarce. The corridors are the strategic veins that are chosen to keep Europe moving forward and keep moving together. And Rail Baltica is an important part, if not really one of the most important parts ever so far, of this whole strategic thinking. It's definitely a very important part of the North Sea Baltic corridor. So this is a good starting point when it comes to funding the project during the post-2020 MFF. It's already widely understood that these regions should be better connected to the rest of Europe for everyone's sake. So under the current MFF, transport policy and infrastructure projects are financed via several instruments, depending on what type of project is at hand and what is the context. It's the Connecting Europe Facility, CEF, or the European Fund for Strategic Investments, EFSI, European Structural and Investment Funds, and Horizon 2020. And let's not forget the national budgets, like I said. CEF is one of the most important instruments with proven benefits and clear added value. And this always was very striking for me personally. CEF can really give you proof of money well spent. And it's all in numbers, it's all in tabulations. And having strong priorities for CEF funding is one of the reasons for its success. A significant part of CEF transport financing is directed towards completing TEN-T core network corridors. And completing Rail Baltica would then eventually contribute exactly to this goal, so it's self-evident that EU financing for Rail Baltica comes from this instrument. Let me quote just some numbers. The CEF has been instrumental in funding key European infrastructure. In 3.5 years since its launch, and it had the overall grant budget of 23.4 billion euros for this period, 2014 to 2020. So out of the 21.3 billion in transport grants that have been launched, have triggered 41.6 billion euros in investments, which are complemented by the EFSI, the European Fund for Strategic Investments, and the European Structural Funds. So with over 90% of CEF funding for the period now allocated, and funding under the 2015 call oversubscribed to the factor of almost 2 to 1, it's clear that we will need some alternative sources for financing. Then there are the structural funds, another important source of financing for transport. And because of national envelopes, they are more difficult to cut in annual budgetary procedure than, for example, CEF. The structural funds are expected to make approximately 70 billion, that's 70 billion euros available for transport projects by 2020. And roughly half of this money will be allocated to projects eligible under the Cohesion Fund, and the other half will be made available for projects eligible under the European Regional Development Fund. So, total estimated costs of Rail Baltica are approximately 5.8 billion, and the Commission has agreed, so far at least, to finance 80 to 85% of it. The rest of the money, of course, comes from Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So it comes from, and I want to underline this, that it comes from the member states that implement the projects and benefit from it right from the beginning. But we are not there yet. Originally, as we know, it was supposed to be finished by 2020, and now the goal is 2026. The European Commission has said that it would rethink its obligation to provide funding for the implementation of the project if the Baltic states fail to reach an agreement on the project's technical details. So it's now absolutely essential and crucial to implement these agreements and to agree on the rest of the issues that still remain to be agreed upon. But let's not forget why we all love not just TEN-T, but specifically Rail Baltica. The estimated benefits of a completed Rail Baltica are expected to be more than 16 billion euros. Moreover, the paybacks would not be limited to the Baltic states only. Reduced travel time, better connections, and cutting CO2 emissions will benefit the general public, businesses and travelers all over Europe. So Rail Baltica, simply put, just creates welfare. Now, in this connection, I really want to mention, because of the member state where I come from, that it will not end here, and it should not end here. And this is very, very important for everybody to understand, that we are not looking at short legs one by one, and they should not be looked at only from national perspectives. And this entails everything. Also, as far as I can see, the way the whole project will and can be implemented as far as financial aspects. But when we get to the benefits, it gets even more important. And that's why I use every opportunity in my member state to always talk about this. If I was a minister in the Finnish cabinet, the government, I would definitely speak for a large strategic perspective, and there the European funding and also the cohesion funding is of utmost importance. But let's not also forget the symbolism. With Rail Baltica, the Baltic states are reconnecting to Europe. The standard European gauge 1435 railway makes connecting Europe via rail smoother and cheaper. It is clear that Rail Baltica will not be completed during the current MFF. That's clear. So it's essential to give this project particular attention and financial support in the next one. Good thing is that we have strong evidence on the huge added value that CEF-funded projects bring to Europeans. In these negotiations, we have to remind about those added values. So in the coming MFF negotiations, we must guarantee that, one, the overall level of MFF is adequate, two, economic development and Europe's unity are given enough importance, and three, transport infrastructure projects can be financed through both CEF and structural funds with grants and financial instruments. I will end in about 1 minute and 30 seconds for all those that are worried about the timetable. So where does the European Parliament stand in all this? The European Parliament is a big believer in the usefulness of CEF. The European Parliament supports reinforcing CEF in the next MFF. We think that an updated and more effective CEF program should cover all modes of transport, and we are for prioritizing greater links between comprehensive networks and modes of transport that contribute to reducing CO2 emissions, and focus on interconnections and the completion of the network in peripheral areas. And like I already said, I am for Rail Baltica. The European Parliament supports Rail Baltica. Our next task is to make the post-2020 MFF work for completing this project. One of the most important things is to convince and remind the member states about the added value and high returns of well-planned and strategic cross-border transport infrastructure. That it is sensible to pool and spend money together on EU level. Now is not the time to cut transport funding. But no matter how strong the will is, Rail Baltica cannot be built from Brussels. That is your job. It is the Balts who get the EU money, but first you have to overcome trust issues and work well together. Eventually, I think you will want to listen to the European Commission on exactly how the money can be dispersed. So you are celebrating, we were celebrating last December, you are now celebrating your 100 years centennial of independence, and significant progress on Rail Baltica would be one of the greatest ways to honor it. Thank you.